I think we can start. So, hello everyone who have joined here. We have a presentation on our latest publication on conscription that has been prepared by our partners in Sweden, Finland. So we have both of the authors today online, and happy to hear their presentation. And afterwards, we can move to some Q&A session for both of them. So please, Fredrik, Karl.
Hello.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, welcome. Shall I start with Karl and I? We've been writing about for a year now. We've been commissioned by GSSC to write a report on conscription as one of the potential efforts to increase scaling up. This is the term that has been used, and it's very trendy in the security community now, we've noticed, which is a useful concept. And so we focused on looking at 5 countries, Sweden and Finland and Lithuania and Poland and Germany and their military service policy. And so Karl and I, we have military backgrounds, both of us. I'm working in a business school, and Karl is currently in the armed forces, and both of us operate in the field of management and organization studies, with particular interest in studying military organizations. And I think I'd like to introduce ourselves perhaps first. Karl, I'll let you say something about yourself.
Okay, thanks. I've been a reserve officer during my whole adult life, basically, and I've combined that with also doing scholarly work with focus on the armed forces. I have had many happy collaborations, one of which is with Christopher, who is now in attendance, with some visits to King's College over the years. I've been working at the Swedish Defence University, but also at civilian universities. And I've combined that with having a sort of regular officer, different assignments with a focus on anti-aircraft. So that's basically my background: a bit of military practice and a bit of academic theory in happy combination. So over to you, Fredrik.
I've been a lecturer for 10, 15 years in different business schools, and currently in a Swedish-speaking business school based in Helsinki. I've been previously working at Warwick Business School, and I'm trained at Lancaster University in the UK. And my thesis is on the long history of recruitment, and which I, unsurprisingly perhaps to some of you in attendance, trace back to the 16th century in Northern Europe, and that interplay between the state and the development of the standing army as we know it since, and how that then has been translated into the world of organization theory in the business context. So I'm interested in that sort of linkage, and that also sort of is a good segue into saying something about why we're interested in conscription as one of the forms of military recruitment. And so that's the positioning. So it also says something a little bit, just to move on, kind of to frame our study. Karl and I both having a Swedish background, and then we have our neighbor, Finland, which has a particular history when it comes to military recruitment, as well as one of the outliers or one of the unique exceptions in the European context. And we've looked particularly at those 2 countries when it comes to this. So the first, the kind of, if there is one main underlying research question that we've attempted to answer or address in this report, it is this one: that what kind of models for conscript training are there that could be emulated by other nations to increase the volume of soldiers. So then we've looked at these 5 countries, and those of you who are astutely aware that Germany and Poland don't have currently any conscription, but they have varying histories of having it, and they have their own military recruitment policy as well. So we've looked at those countries, and Sweden and Finland have currently conscription, and so does Lithuania. So another kind of underlying aspect is to show how smaller or less prepared, medium-sized countries who are less prepared can scale up effectively. And our kind of findings, which we'll come to later, is that we've looked in particular at the Swedish and the Finnish material to address that question. So it's kind of skewed in terms of data towards that. What we'd like to do today is to not go into all the details of the report and all the findings. It's available to be read, and maybe by some of you already. But we'd like to sort of gear towards kind of policy recommendations. So that's the nature of today's report. Anything else there on that slide, Karl?
No, I think you captured it well. We have partly because that's where our expertise is the greatest. We have focused on the existing systems in Sweden and Finland, with possible implications for countries who want to quickly increase the number of soldiers to face a Russian threat, which is now the focus of the discussion. So that's basically it, I would say.
Yes, and of course, the question of conscription, just to add something, is that's not coming out of nowhere. It is, of course, something that has been a very hot topic since 2015, and in particular since 2022. Even countries who are typically seen as not conscript orientated, such as the UK, and I'd be very interested to hear if I'm mistaken in that, have considered it, perhaps a bit flippantly and provocatively, but nonetheless, it's on the agenda. Conscription is on the agenda. So that, I think, is also one of the reasons for exploring it. And it's a very visible phenomenon. Okay, so to start looking at some of the numbers, the question of cohort capacity use is relevant, and I don't want to go through all the details on this slide, but here we see the 5 countries, and out of those that have conscription, Finland is using 35%, more than 1/3 of its entire male and female cohort per year, whereas Sweden is using 7%, and Lithuania is somewhere there in between. So first point there is just to say that there is a variety in the usage of the degree to which you're using the available pool of recruits, and if you're interested in scaling up, those are numbers to consider and take into consideration. Next slide, Karl, what do you think?
Yeah.
So what are some of the kind of constraints that you're facing when it comes to scaling up? Well, obviously there is infrastructural constraints, such as facilities, lack of equipment, overextended or overburdened military personnel. What is the current state of the infrastructure and material that after sort of reductions in the forces in the last 3 or 4 decades? So the benchmark, I suppose, is the Cold War levels, and if you look at the Swedish case, for example, it would be the equivalent of something like 40,000 men and women per year at those levels, which would be completely unrealistic, given those material and physical constraints. So that's a factor to consider. Same with the German example, that if they were to reintroduce a full-scale conscription system, they wouldn't have the infrastructure to support it. According to someone that we spoke to, who used to be the military attaché to Berlin, it would collapse the German system. So conscription is not something that is a separate factor. It is operating in a context of what can be supported. Karl, anything?
Yeah, and it's a bit paradoxical that now with the discussion of scaling up, there has basically been 2 to 3 decades of scaling down, the way you sort of dismantle the old military establishment and you close down regiments, bases, etc., etc. So now everything is quickly been done in reverse, and it proves much more difficult to increase capacity than to reduce capacity. So that's basically one of the major limitations now is not. You could actually, as the previous slide showed, you could actually access more young persons to train, but you don't have the buildings, the weapons, or the trainers to train them.
Yes. I suppose that one thing that we aren't mentioning in this report, but I could just mention that in passing, is that the concept of scaling up and scaling down, which we owe an insight we owe to Christopher Dandeker, is that if you're scaling up also has the implication that you're scaling down. It's not the same as growth or growing or mobilizing. It's a dynamic notion. It's in reference to something. So it's something that so scaling up implies that you have a consideration of at some point also scaling down. So that's, I suppose, something that is worth considering when militaries define and think of themselves in scaling terms, such as the Dutch do explicitly. Okay.
Let's crack on.
Yeah. I'll let you, Karl.
Yeah. So we basically said that with these constraints, at least short-term and medium-term constraints, you sort of have to make decisions on what changes you need to make if you want to increase volume. And one, you could do a number of small things, and one of the more important ones is to increase the number of trainers, as most armed forces are constrained. There is, however, a possibility to use more part-time personnel, and there is sort of a cultural resistance from regulars to say that, well, we don't want to use part-timers because they are not professional enough, etc., etc. But there are a number of examples where this has worked really well. And one interesting example that we early identified is the Interflex training program for Ukraine civilians who are sort of speed trained to become soldiers. And this was an initiative started in the UK. A total of 30 nations provided trainers for this effort, including Sweden. And it started out with regular personnel who went there to train. And the training it started out as a 5-week training course. It was then slightly adjusted, so they added on 2 more weeks, so that the new standard became 7 weeks. But still, as a short training, this required a lot of effort on the trainers who sort of carried out this, and it was decided after a few rotations that the Swedish regulars would be replaced by part-timers, home guard officers and home guard soldiers. and they reportedly did a great job, which proved that you could sort of relieve the regulars by using part-timers. So you actually have in many countries reserve officers or part-time soldiers who can perform at an adequate level when it comes to training. So this would be one of the more important recommendations to increase the usage of part-time military personnel. Then there's also internal changes that could be made. There's a discussion in Sweden, for example, that some human resource reforms have locked officers in peacetime administration to an excessive amount, that you should basically reorganize the human resource work to free up officers to carry out proper military work. Instead, now we have a staggering number of officers who spend many hours every day filling out what is basically peacetime human resource reports, which is it's a very strange reform, and it was implemented in the early 2000s, so it was not at all designed for today's situation. A third recommendation could be in the margin. You could sort of intensify conscript training every week. You could add perhaps a few hours with the overall objective to have a slightly shorter conscript training, because that's where we will end up. But we handle these both. We want to increase training capacity, but we will also want to make changes to the training itself, which brings us to the next slide. You could also, as a last measure to increase training capacity, you could sort of specialize. For example, infantry training is now being carried out at all army regiments, anti-aircraft, artillery, engineers, etc. And one way to sort of make more efficient this basic infantry combat training would be to sort of have some infantry regiments basically doing that basic training for every army unit, perhaps increasing efficiency a few percent. So we not found a silver bullet. We're rather trying to stack a number of proposed solutions to somehow increase the throughput and find some efficiencies. It's basically a sort of consultant approach. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and one way of doing that is, or do you want to carry on, Karl?
No, now we basically come to the main recommendation is to try to trim. We're not aiming for the Interflex 7 weeks, but we do suggest that you could probably find an optimum which is shorter than what most conscript training regimes are now. So that's why we ended up with a recommendation mapped on the Finnish model, which Fredrik will describe.
So one of the central aspects of the Finnish model is that they unlike the other conscription systems, that training systems that we're looking at in this report, but also in general, is that they train two cohorts per year, and one starting in January and one starting in June. And the first contingent undergoes basic training, and then for the second period is very central in delivering the training for the second contingent. And that is an efficiency approach that combines a number of those factors that we addressed earlier, such as overcoming that cultural obstacle of having non-regular officers to conduct being the primary trainers. So that's one way that the Finns are doing it, which of course is an anomaly. It is an exception because they never went for the all volunteer force, which they're relatively smug about currently, thinking that we were right all along. So the Finnish system addresses that issue. One aspect or one limitation that brings with it is the issue of what does that mean for the particular skills and capabilities that are expected from a country in the far north, above the Arctic, in the Arctic climate zone, and which is the case for for Norway and Finland and Sweden, that they have capabilities to train in extremely cold weather. And also, since they are, as part of NATO now, expected to carry out such capacities, and anyway are in terms of national defense, this is a limitation. The Swedes, for example, are reluctant to adopt such a model because it means that only one contingent is trained under such circumstances per year. However, for a country that is closer to further south or in a different climate and with different mandates, that's perhaps not a limitation. But with such a model, and please appreciate our flippant, crude numbers here. But if, for example, Swedish armed forces are training something like 8,000 soldiers per year, they managed to reduce the training period length to something like 6 months. You could maybe double the numbers to something like 16,000. So this is just an illustrative number. Anything else there, Karl?
No, and one thing we discovered during the production of the report was that currently Sweden sees no reason to dramatically scale up. But as the discussion goes on, everything now is linked to the current proposed organization, and there is already discussion that Sweden should go from having one army division to 3 army divisions, and then of course our recommendations would become slightly more interesting also for Sweden. But we think that perhaps the model could be an inspiration for countries like Germany, Poland, or other who might want to increase the soldier volume quickly. So this is basically just suggestions, and every country will of course use them if they feel they are relevant. So this is like an illustrative case. So
Yeah.
let's crack on.
I suppose it's worth pointing out that we're mostly concerned with army. I suspect that everyone that is invited to this talk, but it's worth pointing out that our focus is primarily the army because that's where conscription reaches its greatest mass.
Yeah, that's where the big volumes are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one aspect that is worth considering is this peculiar notion, at least from people who come from outside of political science or political theory, of casualty sensitivity, which is a notion that is the equivalent of price elasticity of demand for people who are in business schools, such as myself and also Karl's on some days. So it's the kind of it refers to the willingness of the public in nations to for kind of casualty losses in combat, and that's very a notion that is developed in the American context heavily connected to the foreign wars, especially Korea and Vietnam. But this notion of it's interesting to think about that in terms of what is the casualty sensitivity then of different countries, and how is that relevant in a post or in an era that is defined by the Ukraine type of warfare, which is heavily reliant on drone warfare and the advent of the notion of no kill of kill zones that are several kilometers wide. How wide is it there now? 20 kilometers or something like that.
Even further, I think.
So instead of doing this kind of big surveys of what is the casualty sensitivity in different countries, one way of gauging that sort of tolerance level is indirectly by looking at what are the practices in deploying soldiers and what are the practices available in terms of mitigating casualty sensitivities through the development of technology and the deployment of technology and enacting of different technological solutions. So, for example, one notion that has crept up in the NATO context and driven that is in the American army, for example, is the notion of forward line of own robots, so that you develop an increased usage of robotic systems, for example, surveillance, but also the use of robots when it comes to transporting of wounded soldiers and equipment and logistics and infrastructure like that. And so the use of robots and in front of a forward line of own troops is a sign that there is a casualty sensitivity that is different, for example, in the NATO context, perhaps greatest in the American case. Historically, that's the case compared to the British. But as now countries that very recently were neutral, such as Sweden, are engaging in considering Western warfare in a way that they hadn't previously, this question becomes relevant, and this has an impact on the nature and the quality of conscript or military training in general, and how do you integrate not only new technology in the operations of armed forces, but also how do you train soldiers? So it's a kind of a slightly long-winded way of getting into thinking about the nature or the quality of the training and what demands that places on the type of conscripts and the type of soldiers and also officers that we see in the changing nature of warfare as we go ahead. Long point, Karl, do you have anything to add?
No, that's basically that became more and more important during the production of the report, I think, driven also by this initiative that we will touch upon.
You mean next slide then?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. So we basically started out with I think it was Jacques Van Dorn, the decline of the mass army.
Yep.
Where they basically the basic points were that in the 60s and 70s that they said that the military technology became so complicated and complex that it was not possible for conscripts to learn everything that was needed because the conscript training periods were too short. And there were also other reasons, but one of which was military technology being complex. But now we sort of have not a return to a mass army, but at least a step in that direction. But what has happened is that civilian technology has developed at a much quicker pace than military technology. So now we have a discussion that perhaps the scaling up should not It should not aim just for producing infantry soldiers or foot soldiers in a traditional sense, but now you want to train smart people, infantry combat, so they can use that context to develop new technologies. And this is a very interesting example that a very bright captain in the Swedish lifeguards, he started recruiting soldiers and officers for his battalion. And he didn't really expect this, but it turned out that over 3/4 of the persons that he recruited, they were engineering students, both reserve officers and part-time soldiers. And when they started going on exercises, they of course discussed the Ukraine war and technology, and they started a sort of bottom-up innovation, and they developed an unmanned ground vehicle, which they used in their organization, and they got rewarded by the head of the Swedish army, and this sort of spurred a new initiative. So now, as I said, that not everybody goes on vacation, that now by the end of June and the whole of July, this initiative has now grown. So they will have a 5-week startup style innovation activity in Stockholm, which is called Strilab, as you see there, which is basically war lab or combat lab. So there will be a number of officers, soldiers, but also they have connections to industry. So companies like Palantir and OpenAI, they have contacts with those companies. So they will basically have a structured model where they will try to find technological solutions to military problems. And this is an aspect that we thought that, well, maybe countries should not just train normal infantry soldiers. They should also perhaps collaborate with universities of technology, that some of the people that they train in military skills should also be encouraged to do engineering training. And perhaps you could link that engineering to military problems and innovation structures. So that will be a sort of a, in a way, it's sort of a return to the origins of military academies, which were very often military technological oriented. So now this will become sort of a modern version of the early military academy, which had often the first engineering schools were often military, etc. So this is a fascinating example, and we don't know yet what will come of it, but because it will start in a couple of weeks. I will go there to observe at least a couple of times, I hope. So this is and the proposed term for this soldier engineer is soldineer. It's a sort of perhaps too cute, but it follows an old discussion about sort of hybrid professionals who combine military skills with other fields of knowledge. So soldineer is here a proposed term. It's not an established term. Anything you want to add, Fredrik?
Just to link this back more to the question of conscription and military recruitment, and then it becomes relevant to then consider what, since the changing nature of warfare requires engineering capabilities and skills from the individual. This also means that recruiting forces can start thinking in terms of how can you stimulate people with those skills anyway existing in higher education, for example, contexts, and to participate in shorter periods of time, for example, and non-regulars as well in military as military recruits. And I know that Lithuania have to some extent started to stimulate those practices in their recent reform, which we also cover in the report. Next or final points, Karl, do you think?
Yep.
Okay. Do you want to go?
Well, but basically, the big recommendations are a sort of shortened training regime. We haven't really described that in detail, but that of course it requires some prioritization. That we during the all volunteer force in Sweden, a lot of sort of nice things were added to the training, but now you basically have to go in the other directions. You have to reduce training in order to make it shorter. So we try to shorten the training, but also add this the soldenier aspect, that you should perhaps not only try to think about traditional soldiers, but also try to find structures to infuse this innovation and technology aspect of not only officers but also soldiers, because you might find new solutions from that branch which don't exist today, and we've seen the innovation capacity of Ukraine's armed forces is spectacular, and that's something that I think Western armed forces need to take account of.
Okay, so thank you very much for the presentation of the publication. And I think we will move on to the questions now. I will start from my side, but we already have some questions in the Q&A section. So everyone here listening to the presentation, please feel free to ask either by text or by raising a hand, and I will let you speak here. So talking about your recommendations and the Finnish model, so how do you see and what do you think, what elements of the Finnish model are the most transferable to countries such as Lithuania or like Latvia and Estonia in the Baltic region? How do you see that we could implement it the best in our region, and how can we learn from the model here in Lithuania?
You want to go first, Fredrik?
No, well, I think that one aspect to think about is that the strongest point is to think about how can you use that sort of overlap, so that if in a sort of rapidly scaling up and the using of personnel, you can have trained conscripts as instructors as well, or not fully, but that becomes one way of at least addressing that question of kind of overburdened regular instructor as a constraining factor. And that's a system that has worked and has taken, I mean, that has been perfected over basically since the Second World War in the Finnish case, which makes them ridiculously unique. For one thing, that they've trained the Estonians in that system already early on in their independence. So that's one thing too. That's perhaps the main thing that I think is most relevant in terms of looking at that Finnish model. It's that they train two cohorts, and the first cohort trains the second. I can say more.
We have a question in the Q&A section.
I can't see the other participants. How do I do that? I'm sorry, I'm incompetent.
Yeah, you can move your mouse to the program line, and you see the Q&A button. If you do not see that, please press more, and then there will be a Q&A section, so you should see that.
Sorry, I didn't.
If you cannot find it, I can move to the first question from the Q&A. I can read it out loud.
Yeah.
It's also here, like an add-on to this question. So the question goes as follows. Can a 6-month training period realistically prepare conscripts for high-intensity warfare against a peer adversary, or does it primarily produce personnel suitable for territorial defense and support roles? How do you see that?
It's a good question. I think that the 6-month suggestion is not the sort of ideal version. This is a recommendation born out of the existing limitations that if you want to increase volume quickly and you have a reduced capacity and no way to quickly increase it, then you are faced with a choice. Either you carry on with longer training, which means smaller volumes, or you do something that you want to increase volume, and one of the obvious possibilities then is to modify the output, so to speak. You have a shorter training, and I think this is sort of a finding an optimum level. It's not finding the perfect level. And 6 months, I've spoken to many of my Army colleagues who have extensive experience, and we have at least, if we take the current training regime, which is 9 months, we have at least identified several weeks that you can basically cut out without losing any military capability whatsoever. One of the things that we describe in the report is this ceremonial duty that is very nice for Swedish conscripts to guard the King's Castle in Stockholm. It's part of the conscript training that you sometime you train and you put on special equipment and you do this high guard, as it's called, and it's a nice memory, and it's nice for the family to come and watch, but it adds very little in terms of military capability, and our suggestion is that you could sort of rearrange that. You could put it outside the conscript training, and you could perhaps add it on afterwards as a paid activity, that you'll be hired to undergo this training and carry out this guarding the King's Castle, and that would sort of free up several weeks of training for doing other stuff, or to reduce training times. So basically, we think that with of course, it won't be as good, but with very little reduction in quality, you could basically do the bare minimum in 6 months, and then you could call people in for rehearsal training after a couple of years. So this is a way to quickly increase volume. It's not the way to do the perfect military training. But the second part of the question is, would it primarily produce personnel suitable for territorial defense and support roles? Perhaps, but we think that you could get close to the mark also in 6 months, because the expectation would not be to send people right to the trenches, but if you are called up for service, you could probably continue your training for a few weeks before you are put into a combat unit. But I think the whole report addresses wanting to increase when the system is not really prepared for it. We also have this interesting next question, if I can move on.
How do you see
Yeah.
these questions?
Now you have a Q&A. There is a Q&A in the bottom.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can read it aloud while you will be searching for the button. Maybe you should
Okay.
close
Yeah.
the screen sharing and then afterwards move to the bar with the options that on the screen. So the next question
Okay.
is that
Now I see.
several NATO countries face recruitment difficulties. Is the problem really the lack of conscription, or is it broader societal challenge related to demographic changing attitudes towards military service and other factors? How do you see that?
Yeah. I think all of the above. That there is we didn't include it in the report, but initially we discussed much about this individualist turn that back in when I did my military service in the mid 1980s, you had what was on the rise then was sort of new public management, Thatcher Reagan reforms, and much more individualistic culture. So basically in Sweden, the sort of social democratic contract between citizen and state was being rewritten, and we had neoliberal policies that has sort of redefined the relationship between the individual and the state. And as Thatcher said, there is no society, there are only individuals. And if that becomes the norm, then what reason does the individual have to be conscripted and risk his or her life in the trenches for the country if there is no society? So I think the question is very relevant. That even though you see now that there is a surge in interest in Sweden for doing military conscription, it's still a minority, and you have large parts of the population who are not really that interested. That there is an interesting disproportionality that in Sweden now you basically have mostly people from good socioeconomic backgrounds who want to do military service, whereas sort of immigrants and people who are poor are much less interested in doing military service. So you have it's quite skewed, the young people who come in to do military service, and so there is certainly a big difference between the situation during the Cold War and the situation now.
Just to add something there, perhaps it's worth saying that if you have an intake in the Swedish case of 6.7% of the cohort, and you have a heavily skewed recruitment towards high socioeconomic background and high academic and higher middle class, I think that's worth setting in the context in the particular case of Sweden also, Karl, don't you think? Like what we're talking about here in terms of dismantling of armed forces and the move towards the all volunteer force in the first place is because of the demographic recruitment from the opposite end, the lower income and lower education spectrum, and the protest of that and the deployment of, for example, the Vietnam War. So I think it's worth thinking about what is the threat perception, what happens if there is an escalation, for example, in the Swedish case, if there's an experience of exposure to military engagement, how does that change things? I suppose that's relevant in particular in the Swedish case. I mean, can I ask Donata if you can open the possibility for people to speak and respond to us? We would that's also fine with us and would be interesting to hear people if they
Yes,
can.
so I think I can do that only if any of the attendees raise a hand in case they want to speak, because the settings by default do not let everyone to speak voluntarily. I need to allow that. So
Okay, well, let's encourage people to raise their hands then if they want to say something. I suppose another thing I could say about that 6 months training period question, and if it's real now that I can see it, sorry, but so realistically prepare conscripts for high intensity warfare against a peer adversary. One thing that that struck me was is the question of as always when it comes to um, political organizations or security organizations, as opposed to, for example, private sector or business organizations, is the degree of prestige and symbolics. So, so one aspect is when it comes to the length of training period, is that there might be a communication of a symbolic of does it sound better that you have a 12, 15 months training period as opposed to a 6 month period? And that was a question that was raised and in the German context after the Cold War, where they had an intense and long debate about that question. And worth mentioning as well is that militaries that use and rely on conscription, such as Finland, use conscripts not only for this kind of luxuries that we have identified in the report, such as ceremonial guard, um, but they also use them as workforce. I mean, in the Finnish case, which is a very large force structure, they they admit that they use conscripts in a longer period of time, despite the Finnish model, so to speak, as workforce as cheaper labor, basically, to do things for maintenance or for transportation, for building stuff. So when you're looking at the length of periods, taking that into consideration also puts into perspective of it's useful, but is it useful for a future combat role, or is it to maintain an existing very large and relatively expensive organization? Yeah.
yeah, and do you see any sacrifices of combat effectiveness in the case of like a Finnish model having a shorter one, especially taking in mind that we now have like a situation of always increasing the technology intensive capabilities. So do we have the abilities to adapt those new changes in technology side that we have to a shorter period of conscripts to have them be ready to deal with the newest technology possible if that is like the thing that we have to sacrifice here.
Karl, do you have any input on that?
Is the question about the capacity to use technology or?
Yeah, it's more on that. Just your opinion. How do you see that if there are any like sacrifices from the technological side of the capabilities that we may lose if we have the shorter period of conscripts?
Well, I'm not sure, but I think I think it's an interesting dynamic now that the technology that is being used mostly, well, it's not only civilian technology, but most of the sort of new warfare technologies that are being used, it's civilian technology. We are used traditional to think about weapon systems with like, and we still have those, of course. You have anti-aircraft systems, artillery systems, etc. But now you have I think it was 70s or 80s, that by then the technology development in the civilian commercial sector had sort of overtaken the previous state-funded military technical development. So now you have a sort of technology development in several lanes, so to speak. One, you have the big traditional military systems, but then you also have these innovations that use cheap drones or other technical systems. And I think it's very hard to see how the traditional military establishments will try to systematize or how will they incorporate this new development into their structures. We have one example which is interesting, I think, it's about competence. That I've studied professional military education for many years, and during the so to speak, the peaceful years, the post-Cold War peaceful years, before we realized that Russia was not gone as a threat, many of the Western countries, I think they prioritized some kind of international relation training for many of the officers, because that was what was needed. You had to understand sort of complex politics, and public opinion was very important, because you needed to explain why you sent your soldiers to a very distant country in another part of the world. In some ways, the Russia threat is much easier, but it doesn't perhaps require as much political science. It's more a technical problem. It's not a political problem in the same to the same extent. So I think now that we will likely see a sort of reorientation in the skills and competencies needed for officers, that it will become much more like it was during the Cold War, that you need more engineers and perhaps fewer political scientists in your officer corps, and to the same extent you need technology skills also at very low levels, because that's where the problems present themselves, and they need new technical solutions. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I think that the dynamics are very interesting now, which also brings us to one of the Q&As. I find these questions very interesting.
Yeah, I wanted to move to those as well. And especially on the one regarding the report. So I'm not sure if Fredrik can see the Q&A already, but I will read that out loud. So the question asks, your study focuses on generating larger numbers of trained personnel. In the context of the war in Ukraine, what matters more for deterrence today? Is it mass, technology, or readiness, and why?
Yeah, also a very good question. In a way, I would, a very sort of quick answer would be that readiness could be seen as a function of mass and technology, in a way. That if you have a big mass and lots of technology, that would at least partly explain how much readiness you have. But I think it's sort of all of the above. You need. Sweden went to extremes. I think during the Cold War, we had a sort of planned wartime capacity of 800,000 soldiers.
Yeah.
If we're fully mobilized with the Army, Air Force, and Navy, we would have somewhere around 800,000. We had close to 40 brigades. And today we hope to have 4 brigades in a couple of years. We have a small percentage of the ships and jet fighters we had, and we are so far from the old numbers that, of course, that deterrence it's much smaller. It's true that also Russia have less numbers, but they still they still can have tens of thousands killed every month. Sweden wouldn't last more than 1 month with those casualties that Russia has. So we are mass is of course hugely important for deterrence, but so is technology. So it's not one or the other. You have to have both. And our report has the main focus is on increasing mass by having these shorter training periods allowing for a bigger volume. But we also point to the importance of building capability for developing new technologies. So I would argue that mass and technology means readiness.
Fredrik, what's your opinion on this?
Do you want to add something, Fredrik?
No, I think that's well, maybe one aspect is to say something about the changing nature. Is it who is this addressed to? Is this addressed to an individual armed force, or is it addressed to, for example, an alliance? And the changing nature of the NATO alliance is of considerable relevance, especially for those countries that we're considering now, where Finland and Sweden have just joined NATO, and with drastically changing demands in terms of the nature of their roles within that alliance as opposed to national defense. So I think that's a bit flippant answer, but don't you think that participation in an active membership and an active role from Sweden and Finland, for example, in as part of NATO is part of a deterrence for those countries? I think that's of relevance too.
We have one more question in the Q&A section. Many talk about innovations and new technologies in today's warfare. Could the emphasis on innovation and technology create a risk that Western militaries neglect basic combat skills and fieldcraft, which have proven critical in Ukraine?
I think it's important to be aware of that risk. So far, I haven't really seen the signs of that because the training is still fairly traditional. I think that our army culture runs deep, so to speak. So I don't think that officers will give up on basic infantry skills or. I haven't really seen that, but I think it's a valid point. You should sort of be beware of the risk of becoming sort of PowerPoint centric, where everything becomes innovation, and I think the risk might be bigger, a bit higher up in the organization, but on the training. On the training basis, I don't see any big risk that you will neglect the basic skills, and that's basically where that is being trained. So long term, perhaps if you were to redistribute resources and take away a lot of people from the basic training and put them in different kind of innovation assignments, but So far, I haven't seen any indication of that as a risk.
What we came across, one way of, I think I agree with you that that's a very interesting question, of course, because that's certainly one of the tendencies is all the buzz about the changing nature of warfare because of drones and AI and robotic systems. I mean, one issue that we came across, in particular in the British case, the the British military sociologist Anthony King has participated in that debate, and of course, as with everything, not just in warfare, technology always becomes this kind of panacea, this solution that comes in and solves all the problems. In sustainability science, critical researchers talk about it as solutionism, and that has come up in the British case, where they've drastically. And I'd like to hear from people who know the British case and might correct me, but um, the um, the the considerable sort of reliance on technology as a sort of a solution that means that you don't have to invest in infrastructure and personnel and training numbers and these questions of mass in particular, such as combat training and fieldcraft, but that you just have some sort of AI kill chains that sort everything out. And his point was to say that you need both. Anthony King's response was that you certainly need both trained personnel, a bit like what we were saying in Soldier in Air, and a type of hybrid figure, but also those because who's going to use and man these technology? So that's relevant too. I guess to some extent that addresses the question. I'd like to hear from the people who ask these questions, but instead of answering, yeah, questions that are written, because we always have the final say. We'd rather not have the final say.
Somehow nobody wants to speak today from our attendees. But I also have one more question on you from the report. You were raising the question of social contract and the legitimacy of conscription overall. And as European governments expand military service requirements, what are the greatest risks nowadays for public support? And how can overall policymakers avoid undermining the willingness of the citizens to serve? Do you see this as an issue nowadays, or no? And how do you think that could be improved?
Well, I think one obvious danger would be, for example, Sweden now has, I think it's a slightly reduced battalion in the Baltics, in the forward land forces, and of course, I think if there were some kind of accident or some event where several Swedes were killed, I think that would quickly pose a threat to the willingness to serve, because we haven't really experienced that kind of sort of traumatic event. We had during the Afghanistan mission, the Swedes were quite lucky, I would say, but we still had a number of deaths, I think half a dozen or slightly less. And you could see that even 2 Swedes killed became big news, and that sort of became a discussion. Is this really worth it, etc. Of course, if it's in Europe, it will be slightly easier to defend, but I think that the willingness to serve, it's fragile in terms of casualties, which goes back to what Fredrik said about casualty sensitivity. So as long as everything goes well, I think the willingness to serve is at a fairly high level. but it will, when it becomes obvious for people that the sons and daughters of Sweden have a real risk of getting injured or killed, I think we'll have a new perhaps a new discussion. And it also goes back to the UN missions in the Balkans in the 90s, where Sweden decided quickly that we can't really use our regular equipment if we want to send Swedes to an active combat zone. We have to get better equipment. So you have a sort of everyday discussion, and then the discussion changes when you realize that you're actually going to a real combat zone, and then you quickly realize that some of the equipment that you have is perhaps not good enough.
Fredrik, and thoughts on this?
Is that me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. I think one thing to say is about conscription is, of course, that it needs to, I mean, very strictly speaking, of course, conscription means that you don't have to really consider the willingness to that extent, because actually it is coercive. And the long history of conscription is that it is a form of taxation, in fact. And so it is, of course, the support is of considerable relevance because the public support ultimately is needed for it. But one thing that is tangential to that, which we do address, albeit not an extensive discussion about it in the report, but we do it nonetheless, is to discuss what happens in the different forms of conscription that you might have. So, for example, the distinction between having a lottery system versus to have a voluntary selective system. Sweden has a voluntary selective system, whereas Denmark has a lottery system. I think the Norwegians also. And the difference there, one aspect that I hadn't thought about before, but it struck me, well, we learned that as we did research, is that people in a selective system feel chosen. They are interested in being part of something, and they might, if it's a voluntary, and then to be chosen is to then feel like you belong. It supports the greater sense of a willingness to serve and willingness to sacrifice yourself, perhaps, to having been chosen, which of course goes back to the long history of competitive entrance to anything. Examination is very much a modern phenomenon. So I think that that's something worth considering, given that you're operating with conscription. But if push comes to shove, you have the mandate to force people to enlist, which of course is the experience of Ukraine and Russia. And yeah.
But even Ukraine has problems with willingness to serve.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and they have adopted very forceful conscription methods. So that's one of those issues that is hard to get around, I suppose.
And as we started to move to the end of our discussion today, maybe for the closing question, how do you see, looking ahead to like 5 or 10 years, do you expect Europe to move toward like truly universal conscription or selective systems like Sweden's, or more of a hybrid models? How do you see that in the future, and what are your predictions here? Keeping in mind the recommendations that you've provided as well. So how do you see the future?
I'll let Karl go first.
Well, I think much of it depends on how the war goes for Russia. I think when we started writing this report, the outlook was much more bleak. That there was a sort of discussion that eventually Russia will grind down Ukraine, given Trump's very strange position. But now, for a few months, there is more optimism, and Ukraine has started hitting Moscow and refineries, etc. And so now they say that suddenly they have the upper hand. And I think that now, with all the investment and military expenditure, now there is substantial support for it. For example, in Sweden, all parliamentary parties support this expenditure for military use. But if Russia were to lose, and you could see a more sort of optimistic, I think this. I don't think it will disappear entirely, but I think the sense of urgency will quickly go away, and you will perhaps land in a sort of middle of the road solutions where you have increased military capability, but perhaps not at the levels that are now being discussed. Because basically, this is a political decision, and Europe has many other challenges concerning productivity and economic growth and budgetary constraints. So it's as long as Russia remains a viable threat, I think we will see this push and these kinds of reports. How can you increase military capacity, soldier numbers? But in 5-10 years, that's a long time. So it all depends on what do we think of Russia. I don't think we will go back to the situation that was pre the invasion, but it very much depends on the threat perception. It's hard to foresee, I think.
I think I agree. It's of course impossible, but one thing that has been, I mean, if you take these two cases that we've looked so particularly at, that Finland and Sweden, Finland hasn't changed and Sweden has changed will quite dramatically, and it raises the question back and forth, basically, for a period of time of about 10 years of voluntary system. And the question of system is, of course, has to do with long-term planning, and long-term planning is relevant here. And so if you're introducing this notion of scaling, it means that you adapt to something. In this case, it's one thing when you're doing computer algorithmic programming and you use the notion of scaling. But when it comes to the military organizations, it's in relation to something, in this case, the threat context. So the changing nature of the threat context, precisely as Karl is saying. But relating back to that question of some sort of faith in the system or willingness to serve, that's a long-term notion. And personnel planning requires some sort of system for it to be credible long-term for the personnel that is employed in that system and considers careers in that system, such as conscripts are likely to do, because often one of the major sources of recruitment for officer careers is conscription service. People who have served who've done military service typically is one of the major sources of people who are willing to then become professionals. But it requires that there is a bit of long-term planning, I think, also. So I think that's of relevance too. The German case is relevant, very interesting to look at, because there has been an unwillingness or reluctance for young people to serve, and under some sort of perspective of reintroducing conscription. On the other hand, you have in the Polish case, they've built up. Of course, they don't have a conscription system, but they've built up a very considerable military presence and armed forces organization. What happens to that when it comes to a change in the threat perception or threat context? Do they at some point have to scale down? Have they built into their system of growing their military capacities the ability to scale down when it's needed? That's an open question. Scaling up is one thing, but as with everything, it has to come down. How do you do that? Do you integrate dual use technology? Do you have some sort of dual use? We were playing with the notion of Karl said don't go into it, but now I am. But like the dual use human resource. Can you think of that in the same way that you think of dual use technology? So those are, when it comes to, if you're taking seriously the notion of scalable armed forces, then that sort of thinking, I think, dynamic thinking needs to be integrated. I think a kind of a system, personnel system, that is seriously taking into consideration not just what is short-term threat perception that is to do with Russia, but takes into consideration of 20-year time horizon and is committed to thinking about the people that serve in that personnel system. That's a very important aspect of ensuring willingness to serve, people to sacrifice themselves for their country. The need for conscription, I don't know. We pointed out that maybe it's not the main issue here. Maybe there is a number of other constraints, but it's a very visible phenomena because it affects people and other reasons too. So maybe it's not the main issue. Maybe it's infrastructure. Maybe it's regimental issues like that. Yeah. Okay. Long answer. I don't know if I actually addressed the question. Did I?
Yeah, you did well. And I think we already ran out of time, so thank you very much for joining to this discussion and for preparing this report. It has been very interesting to read and very useful. I do hope so. I do hope it was an interesting experience for you as well to prepare that.
It was.
Sorry?
Very interesting. Very interesting to write this, and we certainly hope you're right that it's useful.
Yes. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining here with us today and see you in the future. Okay, bye-bye. Have a nice summer holiday if you're going to some.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Tiesiog end. Bet apačiai kampe iksiukas ne į tą pusę. O